All right. Well, hello everyone, and today I have something very special, which is I get the opportunity to chat with Sean Korsgaard about sword and sorcery, and specifically the upcoming Battleborn magazine, and we'll get to that. But just by way of introduction, I'll say for people following the channel, you'll know I've been reading a lot of Robert E. Howard this month. And last month was reading some Howard Andrew Jones, still working through Lord of the Shattered Land.
Have you
And
been enjoying
Sean,
the journey?
I do. I did enjoy his stuff. I think having the context of Howard has made me appreciate it more now that I know a bit more of the tradition that he's working in. But yeah, Sean reached out and he's working on a sword and sorcery magazine, and I thought he would be a great person to talk to about the genre as a whole, and then this exciting project that he's working on. So, Sean, I'll let you introduce yourself, and yeah, go from there.
It's a pleasure to be here, and it's been a pleasure watching you dive headfirst into the work of both Howards. My name, for those who don't know, is Sean C.W. Korsgaard. I've worked with Bang Books, Analog Science Fiction and Fact, Writers of the Future, and I'm currently the editor of Anvil Magazine, and as of about 30 days ago, Battleborn Magazine, a brand new and blood-drenched sword and sorcery magazine I hope will take the front lines of fantasy by storm. I'm a U.S. Army veteran, award-winning photojournalist, and a proud father of a young toddler, so in case you hear somebody in the background, for all of you listening in now. But I've been a fan of sword and sorcery before I even knew that that was the name of the genre. Since I was 13 years old, and like many a young teenager before me, I stumbled upon a Conan paperback in a used bookstore and fell head over heels in love with the genre from the first page. From the Ken Kelly cover to Robert E. Howard's prose. And from there, I made my journey through the work of Michael Moorcock, Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser, Fritz Leiber, Elric of Melniboné, David Drake, and while I have much love for the masters of epic fantasy, from Tolkien to Robert Jordan, sword and sorcery has always been the part of the fantasy genre I fell in love with. The hard-fighting heroes facing fearful odds, terrifying magic and dark gods in the darker corners of the earth. That authentic action that makes you feel every swing of the sword, the pulp prose that sings like poetry off the page, and the tradition that goes back a century, all the way, even before Robert E. Howard, to Lord Dunsany or Harold Lamb, and the authors today who continue to carry that torch ever onward. It's a beautiful genre, and I'm proud to be, in my own small way, contributing to that grand heroic tradition.
Yeah, well, that's great. So you mentioned a little bit there something that I wanted to kind of lead off with. Um, Tolkien is often called like the grandfather of fantasy, and really what people mean when they say that is epic fantasy. So what sets, and most people, even if they haven't read sword and sorcery as a genre, are at least familiar with the term. What sets sword and sorcery as a genre apart from, say, like epic fantasy?
That's an entire master's thesis right there. I've given whole lectures on it, but there are 5 things, and I actually covered 4 of them. But what sets sword and sorcery apart from the other fantasy subgenres is a combination of those 5 factors. The first is its protagonist. They are built in the tradition of the Japanese Ronin or the Western cowboy, where they're often nomadic heroes, underdogs, often anti-heroes. Biggest giveaway, your sword and sorcery hero is an anti-hero? They use magic. But they often have to fight to make a living. They're often out of their depth. And that is whether or not they're like Elric, the emperor of a dying empire, or Conan, an eventual king by his own hand. Or Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser, where they're just thieves who keep stumbling into twisted adventure after adventure. Then you have the environment in the world. And very often they take place in far-flung, forgotten parts of our past, or dark corners of our future beneath a dying sun, or seedy underbellies of a city of thieves with dark secrets around every corner. Then you've got the threats and sort of obstacles they face. Compared to epic fantasy, where magic can be a thing of wonder, it's an element of terror in Sword and Sorcery. That is part of the DNA of it, coming alongside Lovecraftian horror and weird tales, that it's not something to be trusted. Magic in Sword and Sorcery is akin to nuclear weapons or nuclear energy in science fiction, and should be treated as such. It's not something that you can use without consequence. Likewise, the monsters and dark gods in the corner of the world draw from that Lovecraftian tradition. Then there's the action. More than any other element, the action is important. I love Professor Tolkien. I love epic fantasy. But The Hobbit knocks out Bilbo right before a battle of 5 armies, and we don't hear a word of it but post-haste. George R. R. Martin will repeatedly ignore entire battle scenes and have them explained to them after they happened. Or if epic fantasy does have a combat scene, it is bird's eye view. Meanwhile, Sword and Sorcery, you're right there in the trenches. You feel every blow, every cut. It makes you feel like you're ringside at a prize fight. I would use the differentiate between, like, if you're studying World War II, it is the difference between Stud Terkel's The Good War and Audie Murphy's To Hell and Back. One is a nice general overview, and the other makes you feel like you're right there in the trenches, and that is Sword and Sorcery. But the fifth element is that pulp tradition. The prose should be a little more lurid, a little more poetic. It should sing off the page and grab you from that first sentence, because Sword and Sorcery is a genre that lived and died by people being pulled in by the title in that first paragraph and leaving you starved to come back for that next issue or that next novel. You can have some wonderful world building and some very creative novels in the genre, but this is a genre where the economy of words and the prose hits you over the head from the beginning and makes you fall in love right until the very end. But those 5 factors combined, you can have 2 or 3 of them and still be Sword and Sorcery, but a great work will have all 5 and do so in a memorable way.
That's interesting. And I mentioned before we started recording here, that I heard you talking with Jonathan Cohen a little bit ago as well about some of the projects you've been working on. And if memory serves me right, when you were talking about modern day iterations of Sword and Sorcery, you threw out a couple of names that aren't usually marketed as such, but definitely fit in that definition, like Joe Abercrombie, Scott Lynch. Larry Correia maybe leans into that a little bit more than some of those do in terms of the marketing of branding, Saga, the Forgotten Warrior as Sword and Sorcery. But I wondered if you would talk about that a little bit in terms of modern authors who write in the tradition.
For those 3 authors especially, I think part of the reason there wasn't a big marketing push for it is they were authors that gained their fame and made their names when Sword and Sorcery was and I say this from the perspective of the publishing industry. There were authors still writing it, books still coming out, but from the people who signed the checks, it was a dead genre. One of those things working at Baen Books is that I got to talk with Tony Weisskopf about some of the stuff Baen did in the 90s. They were still publishing Sword and Sorcery in the 90s. And the look she'd get in her eyes describing some of those sales numbers, he usually only see from guys at Norwegian Hall who fought at Fallujah. It was not a good time. The 90s were wonderful for many things, not for people who like Sword and Sorcery. So there was an incentive for these authors to brand themselves as something different, because the brand was, on paper, poison. So Joe Abercrombie was Lord Grimdark. Scott Lynch was... they pushed that he pulled a lot of his work from video games. I mean, Locke Lamora is named after a character in Final Fantasy VI. Larry Correia, of course, has his own fan base, but they still fit within that grand tradition. And especially if you talk to Larry or Scott, and I've yet to meet Joe, I would like to one day. They have that breadth of knowledge, that love of the genre. I mean, for God's sakes, both of them were dear friends of Howard, that alone. But, for example, Larry, of all people, gives one of the finest breakdowns of the tragedy of losing Robert E. Howard at the age we did. Makes a stunning case that had he lived another 40 years, he could have been the American Tolkien. And I would argue still is, because Howard made the American fantasy tradition. Scott Lynch, meanwhile, I just saw him at DragonCon on a panel waxing poetic about the work of David Gemmell, who was another one of those authors who carried the torch of sword and sorcery past its supposed end of sell-by date. All of them know the genre, they know its classics, and they pulled that into their works. But I think maybe the most important thing is they kept that tradition alive until we had the Renaissance we have now. And I hope they get the credit for that someday, because for every empire, you need a Byzantine Empire to keep it going just a little bit longer until everyone else is ready to pick up the torch.
That makes a lot of sense. What do you think has changed about the market for like sword and sorcery since a century ago to now, where now maybe using that as a title or being upfront about like, here's what I'm writing is a little bit more viable than maybe it was a decade or two ago?
So a couple of factors. The first and biggest is that epic fantasy has, with the exception of known names, Brandon Sanderson can sell whatever he puts his name on. He's Brandon Sanderson. He will write 10 sequels in the next 3 years. Whatever his secret is, every author wants it, as they should. He's Marvel. But if you're a new author, and you should speak with some new authors in epic fantasy for all of our viewers, it's a killing field out there. 20 years ago, you could write an epic fantasy series, have some moderate success as a mid-list author, and have a chance to develop and build on your own. Now, your publisher, if you're a writer of epic fantasy, will know whether or not they're keeping you or dropping you by book 2. The sales numbers have declined every year since 2011 or 2012. And even the bigger authors, I won't say who, but let's just say they had a very popular TV show that peaked in 2019, and so did his sales. And the crown is up for grabs. You see a big push by Lit RPG, by Romantasy, and especially as Romantasy has grown, there is a hunger for people who prefer more heroic fiction, and that is a huge way that sword and sorcery has taken advantage of. More than that, though, is that we do have a ready and waiting pool of authors who have cut their teeth in this genre for years, kept the torch alive, and they're ready, willing, and have the work for people who want it. C.L. Werner, great author who a lot of you may know from his work on a little franchise known as Warhammer, has Shintaro Oba, this wonderful Ronin who slays demons. I mean, the man's three loves: Warhammer, samurai movies, and kaiju. And he managed to combine all of them into this wonderful sword and sorcery setting as only he could. Or Stephen Shrewsbury, who is this... I say this with love, Stephen. You're built like a brick shit house, and so are your characters. And God, do you feel that this is a man who knows his way around a fist fight. Because all of his characters are these rough and tumble brutalists that you just love to see every action scene from. Skylar Hernstrom, who is a wonderful talent on the indie side of things. Eric Wag, PJ Marquis. These are guys who have lived and died by that pulp tradition, by selling their work in the indie sphere. And I really do hope in the pages of Battleborn they break into new markets, because they certainly deserve it. But that last bit, though, is that compared to epic fantasy, with much love to the doorstopper, this is the age of the ebook and the audiobook. People read on their commute to work, on their coffee breaks. And that is where sword and sorcery truly thrives. And to bring up the late, great Howard Andrew Jones, where I think he and Lord of a Shattered Land cracked the code. For those of you who haven't read it, Lord of a Shattered Land is, much like many classic works of sword and sorcery, written as a serial where each story interlinks. But it was all planned in advance. The novel itself tells a complete tale broken into smaller wholes, which are themselves broken into smaller bits that you can listen to on your coffee break, or read when you've got a little bit of downtime between the kids and a nap, or listen to on audiobook on the way home. Fits that format beautifully. Howard Andrew Jones cracked the code. But I worked in publishing on the trad side, and they'll be the first to tell you, okay, one guy did it. That's a fluke. We need number 2. We need number 3. And I've got some bets on who those may be, but once we have a few more folks that show that that blueprint works, that it applies itself to the modern marketplace, I think we're off to the races. And I'm very excited to see Sword the Sorcery look at the crown epic fantasy has left in the gutter and pick it up with its sword and reclaim the throne that it once belonged to Sword and Sorcery.
That's right, because you said there that some of it is these authors who have cut their teeth on the genre, like they grew up on this stuff. They've immersed themselves in, say, the classics of Sword and Sorcery, and now with success that they have as authors, are able to branch out maybe into this as a subgenre. And like Larry Correia is a great example of that, with being established with Monster Hunter International and then going on to his other work.
To say nothing of his next book, which is very much in that rogue Sword the Sorcery tradition.
Yeah, there you go. And then who we mentioned before we started recording here, like Christopher Rocchio, fans of his just like, space opera, Sword and Planet stuff. I can't count the number of people that have been like, and I've been reading his Sword and Sorcery stories, and those are awesome. And I'm like, yes, great. So,
oh no, seeing Christopher jump headfirst into this is like watching your favorite musician try your favorite genre and knock it completely out of the park. I'm lucky that I can say I've been friends with Christopher for years, that I've been following Sun Eater from the beginning, and every time we talk, one of these days I'm going to bother you into writing fantasy. And he's like, sure, Korsgaard. And then he does, and he's as masterful with Adaman, who, by the by, all of you folks who love Hadrian Marlowe, don't worry, Adaman's going to make you just as head over heels in time. But he is... So I review books for Analog Science Fiction, in fact. And I just reviewed the final Sun Eater book in the next...
It's so
good. One of the things I write is that he's often compared to Gene Wolfe and Frank Herbert. But then with the last Sun Eater book, the question is 10 years from now, we will not be asking if he is their equal. We'll be talking about how far he has surpassed them. And I think Adaman and his work in Sword and Sorcery is going to play a major role in that, because if he does to Sword and Sorcery what he did to space opera, Christopher, I say this with love, your cup runneth over, your talent astounds, and I cannot wait to bask in the glow of the revolution you start.
That's right. I mean, for people who the number of fans that I've heard who have said they read Sun Eater and they said, I haven't read Sword and Sorcery, I don't like short stories.
Buy Battleborn, please. Buy Battleborn. Sorry, I had to do the plug.
That's right. But they've read the Adaman stuff and have been like, oh, this is great. And for a number of them, now that I've been this last month immersing myself in Robert E. Howard stuff, I'm like, hey, if you like Adaman, Queen of the Black Coast, the Phoenix on the Sword, right here. So
one of those reasons I also think it's going to take off is Christopher, as he shows, or as Larry Correia shows, or David Drake, is that grand tradition of space opera, or military sci-fi, or Sword and Planet, are very much the science fiction flip side of the coin to Sword and Sorcery. They pull from that same tradition, character-driven, heroic-focused fantasy, compared to character-driven, heroic-focused science fiction. I mean, there's a reason why authors like David Drake, who is on the Mount Rushmore of military science fiction, is a World Fantasy Award-winning author of Sword and Sorcery. Or Karl Edward Wagner, who himself was a world-renowned editor of horror and fantasy. He loved military science fiction as a reader. But I think I would love to see in the next couple of years, we've got this wonderful generation of military sci-fi authors or space opera authors. Not just Christopher Rocchio. Like, I'm thinking of guys like Rick Partlow, who, to my knowledge, has never written a fantasy story, and I would love to see him take that talent to the genre. Or just, we have so many talented authors in both fields, and one of my favorite things about Sword and Sorcery, it doesn't matter what author you bring it up to, they turn into that 13-year-old kid picking up Conan the first time at the first mention. And wax poetically of their favorite characters or moments. I mean, I watched Marie Vibert at DragonCon on a Red Sonja panel talk about how much she loved reading C.L. Moore the first time, or Alan Smalley talk about how much he's enjoyed reading modern sword and sorcery. But all these distinguished authors, remarkable pedigrees, you bring up sword and sorcery and a giant grin spreads on their face as they hear the call of high adventure beckoning them to write that next story. And I hope many of them do, because we will be richer for it.
So I'll ask you about this, since it's a name that's come up a couple of times in this conversation and is one of the big names when we talk about people who have really brought sword and sorcery as a genre, had a lot of success with it in the 21st century, is Howard Andrew Jones. So I was wondering if you could talk about like what he's done in his Hanavar book specifically, but just with his writing that you said cracked the code. Like, what does he do specifically that maybe copycats or other people who have tried before and missed? What did they not get that he's really got right on?
So first, for all of you watching this who have not yet read Howard Andrew Jones, what are you waiting for? Do it. I mean, is the fact Sam has been reading his way through it not enough? So, plug aside, one of the things that's evident from every word Howard wrote is that he poured his heart and soul into every page. That's one of the reasons why even reading the submitted draft to Lord of the Shattered Land, you've read the book. There is a moment in the second story, I want to know if you can think of it, that sold the book to both myself and Tony. That second story, there's a young girl dying in his arms, having just ambushed a monster, and he's describing his hometown to her. And she notices he's choking up, and she says, "Why are you crying? Warriors don't cry." And they do when a hero dies. She must have liked that, because she smiled as the light faded from her eyes. And reading that draft in the Bain offices, I was weeping. And look, I'm a pretty man's man of a guy. I don't cry, and I have shed more tears from Howard's book and Howard's life than I think for anything but the birth of my son. So he has a gift for touching your soul, even through his prose, which a lot of authors lack. But in terms of his writing style, he very much understands that tradition. This is a man who is responsible for preserving the entire work of Howard Lamb, when otherwise it would have rotted to dust in a garage in Kansas. This is a man who pushed generations of new authors into the field, or kept guys like Adrian Cole and James Eng writing when other people thought their stuff was old hat. He was as well read in the genre that he could cite passage for passage from Robert E. Howard to Michael Moorcock from memory. And his library at his house had everything from pulp westerns to historicals. And one of those things he would read to get into the spirit of Hanavar was he would read Medal of Honor citations, just so he would know the kind of spirit of valor that inhabited real life heroes when it came to writing his fictional ones. And that love of heroism wasn't just on page. This is a man who choked up talking about Audie Murphy. And I'm an Audie Murphy fanboy myself, so me saying Howard loved him more than I did is not praise I offer lightly. When I introduced him to Sabaton, Howard was a Beatles fan, but he found enough love in his heart to tolerate Sabaton. But I think that was the key element missing. There was no wry irony or, okay, I'm writing sword and sorcery, so it's going to be cheap. No, he loved it. There was sincerity to it, and that shone through in his works. Too many people approach this genre like it's schmaltz or it's cheese or, I'm writing the story because I saw a panel van. He wrote it because he loved stories about heroes. Yeah, there's some cheese to the genre, and you know what? I'm going to make you fall in love with it the way I did. That was his approach to it. And It doesn't matter the genre. Approaching it with sincerity and love of it, knowledge of its past, and love of its future and its possibilities. You have that in any author. They will create something wonderful. But for all the people hoping to follow in his footsteps, and there will be many, I have said time and time again, there will come a time when Howard will be as influential as a certain other Howard for an entire generation of authors. But read all you can, honor the past, bring your own elements to it, and never be ashamed of loving that tradition. Bring that to your work. Let it shine through. Add your own flourish. Be as fearless as your heroes when writing about it. Write the kind of thing that touches your soul and touches the hearts and souls of your readers, and you will have made something magnificent. Howard did.
That's interesting. There's a line that everybody take a shot. Sam's going to bring up Gene Wolfe here. There's a line that the Wolfe scholar Mark Aramini that he said about Wolfe is he said Gene Wolfe writes with the I forget how he said it, but it was something like the tender masculinity of like a father, And what was interesting is that was the same type of idea that came to mind when I read Word of a Shattered Land. Of like, there's a certain sense of maturity, to the way that he writes as well. And maybe it's because of the character of Hanavar is, a little bit up there in age, and he's seen more battles than most of the people that he's fighting. So maybe that's some of where it comes from. But I don't know. Like you said, Howard Andrew Jones, just in his writing, you can tell that he commits to the bit like 110%. There's no, like you said, winking at the camera. There's no shred of irony in what he is doing. It's utterly sincere, which is one thing that I really liked about what I had read.
It is, and it's also true about Gene Wolfe. But I think we talked about it a little bit before the recording started, is that there are people who will throw stones at Sword and Sorcery or say that it's outdated or antiquated or needs to change. And Howard was very much of the mind that that was not true, that heroic tradition is in line with the kind of storytelling we've been doing ever since the first cavemen came back from the hunt and gathered around the fire to tell stories of what big men they were, slaying the saber-tooth, throwing spear at mammoth. Since we wrote down on clay tablets of guys named Gilgamesh and his quest for immortality, of a fellow named the English language, the oldest remnant of our tongue, the most spoken language in human history, is of a guy named Beowulf who wanted to be a hero, faced down a monster, killed its mother, won himself a kingdom, and died in its defense against a dragon. A fellow by the name of Beowulf. We are part of that heroic tradition, and that is nothing to be ashamed of, nothing that needs to be changed. People look at Conan and they think of bad panel van art and Worth's pastiches. But Robert E. Howard was one of the most brilliant authors of the past century. Not just fantasy. His prose was so evocative, made you think of far-flung histories and hard-fighting heroes and entire worlds in ways authors can spend their entire lives failing to achieve. That Sword and Sorcery has drawn to its ranks feminists, Vietnam veterans, Black Panthers, drug-addled hippies, conservative Christians, all among its ranks contributing in their own ways, creating heroes and stories and authors' careers that have stood the test of time. Few other genres can say that they have brought such a depth of talent, a wealth of knowledge, such breadth of storytelling. And it's part of what I love about it, is that we don't need to change the genre. We need to look back at what has worked. And we need to tackle that and do the occasional odd twist. Like that was, like you said, one of the things Howard did different. His hero was an old man, supposedly his best adventuring days behind him, or occasionally tries to think his way through a problem as much as fight his way out. But that is very much in the same tradition. Conan, despite the reputation of being Arnold Schwarzenegger, I love the Arnie movie. I adore it. But Conan, as a character, is much more intelligent than even many of his fans give credit for. or for that matter, Alaric of Melniboné. We know him from the many rock ballads he inspired. But he is a Byronic hero in the classic tradition, not just the father of the modern fantasy anti-hero. So we have wonderful traditions that we need not be ashamed of. In fact, we need to learn from them. And I hope we do, because there's nothing to hide there and much to learn as readers and authors. And Howard, Christopher, Larry, a lot of the authors in the field show you can do magnificent new work without having to run from the old ones. In fact, by taking your place alongside them, you're part of that tradition. Take pride. Stand tall.
So before we get to Battleborn and the way the new tradition is moving forward, specifically in this magazine, I do want to ask you, Sean, do you have a favorite? And it can be several if you can't narrow it down to one, but do you have a favorite Conan story?
So, I like you. So I'll spill the beans on a project I'm working on. I've talked a little bit about it with Jonathan and a couple others, but what the heck? I like the way we're going on this. One of those things Howard Andrew Jones is working on, and had spent years of his life planning out, working on, was what he felt would be the definitive text of Sword and Sorcery. Its history, its prose, its great authors. And I was planning a similar anthology, and we had a meeting of the minds and combined them into a single text. And I'm going to see it through. And what this text will be is 20 to 25 authors, 2 essays, one from an author, one from an academic or editor of some note, giving the history of these authors and these characters, some background, so that readers, authors, academics, students can learn from them. And then the short story that best personifies their work or their heroes. Everything from Lord Dunsany all the way to David Drake. Over a century of history of that heroic fantasy and sword and sorcery tradition. And of course, what do you do for Robert E. Howard? What story do you pick for a man who invented more genres in his 20s than some authors achieve in entire careers? And like the first time you throw a punch and the first time you kiss a girl, you never forget your first. Mine was Tower of the Elephant, and I think it's the best personification, not just of Robert E. Howard's work or Conan as a young hero, but of sword and sorcery as a whole, because over the span of the story, first, for all of you in this audience who have never read it, it's in the public domain. What are you waiting for? Go to Project Gutenberg and read it, and then come back here. For those of you who haven't, welcome. Let's discuss. Oh, think of how many tropes have their roots in this story alone. It opens in a tavern, for crying out loud. How many books, D&D campaigns, heroes began their beginnings in a tavern because of this story? It opens with the Hyborian Age poem, "Between the time the oceans drank Atlantis and the rise of the sons of Arius." It became the immortal opening introduction to the Hyborian Age in Conan's world. Conan, introduced as a lithe young man with naught but a sword and the will to fight, getting into a fight with a boastful young thief, hewing up the jewel in the Tower of the Elephant. Climbs the tower, encounters a thief, multiple forms of danger, from tigers to insects. And what he encounters is a space alien. An honest-to-God, elephant-headed space alien. And he encounters this immortal alien intelligence tortured by a wizard, begging for death. And Conan feels such terrible sympathy for it. And despite the wizard grants it. And as the tower crumbles around him and Yog-Kosha, now no longer bound to his withered form, claims his terrible revenge on the wizard, Conan leaves without a sword, literally with less than he came in with. But staring at the heavens, his entire view of existence changed, wondering what comes next. Can there be any greater adventure story than that? I mean, it is the fundamental sword and sorcery adventure story. The hero faces danger, peril, gains hard-won knowledge, and leaves wondering, where will I go next? Where am I going to get my next sword?
It's like something out of True Detective. Like, man, that's crazy. Yeah.
It's just such a marvelous, and all of this in under 10,000 words.
Mm-hmm.
Tells a greater adventure in a short story than some epic fantasy series achieve in 10 books. Which, like I said, it's the perfect introduction to the potential and power of sword and sorcery as a genre. And that's magnificent. That is Howard. That is Conan. That is sword and sorcery.
So much for dumb jocks just punching people, and that's all it is. Like, man, that's a really good way of putting it, huh? So, Sean, why don't you tell us about Battleborn? What's the origin of this? What role did Howard Andrew Jones play in this? And where? Let's talk about Indiegogo as well. Yeah.
So let's start at the conception. Howard was, for those who don't know, the editor of a magazine called Tales of the Magician's Skull. He produced 14 issues of this magazine that, for those of you who are still new to sword and sorcery, I encourage you to seek out, because you will learn the craft from these magazines better than you can from any editor or any teacher. You will discover more authors and characters you will fall in love with than I know I did. Several of these authors have gone on to become not just favorites of mine, but I'm lucky to say dear friends, mentors, Battleborn contributors. But he produced it through a company called Goodman Games, which produces a game series called Dungeon Crawl Classics. Great guy, Joseph Goodman, in charge, but eventually they decided to sell the magazine to an interested party, and it was so Howard could focus on Hanavar and Goodman could produce utterly mind-bending RPGs. For those of you who like rolling dice, Dungeon Crawl Classics is phenomenal. Give him your business. And I know it was hard for Howard. He built a brand, an icon, a milestone in sword and sorcery with this magazine. And while it was nice for him to get to focus on his own work, it was hard. So we talked a bit. I just completed my contract with Bain and was looking for what comes next. And we must have talked for 3 hours, probably much longer. What would he have done differently? What would I have done if I'd been in his shoes? How could you incorporate classics much more into the work? What authors do you wish you would have asked for? And eventually, he's like, oh man, this is great. I just wish I had the time to dedicate for it. And me, bold, ambitious, I have the time for it. The title was his, Battleborn. And the folks at Iron Age Media, I'd sold a story to their 4th issue of Anvil, and they'd approached me about taking over as editor on issue 5, which is upcoming. Please pay attention to Anvil magazine. We've got some wonderful work coming up. I'm not just saying that because I picked them. But I'd mentioned Battleborn to them in passing, and they were as over the moon and excited as I was. The concept is killer. Because that's the other thing we discussed. Sword and Sorcery is very lucky that its indie scene is vibrant. There are a number of magazines. Again, for all of our newcomers, I will give you a few to look up. Sursova, if you love that pulpy prose and classical tradition. New Edge Sword and Sorcery, if you like the more weird stuff. DMR Books does some wonderful reprints and some great original stuff. New Moon Quarterly, especially if you like your stuff tinged with horror, is masterful, and they have some of the best black and white art anywhere. But what Howard and I noticed was missing, especially since we had no guarantee what the new publishers of Tales would do. By the way, Cullen Bunn is the new editor of that magazine. I'm excited to see what they do with it, even as their distinguished competition. But what was missing was that heroic tradition, that action focus, that character-focused storytelling, that the fundamental beating heart of Sword and Sorcery was not the singular focus of any one magazine. It's literally in the title of Battleborn. We want people to know every story is going to be character-driven and action-focused to the extent You will fall in love with these characters. We will throw them through the gauntlet, leave you on the edge of your seat, your pulse pounding like a battle drum from page to page, and then hungry for more in our next issue. You may know some of these authors. You may know some of these heroes. Some of them may be brand new, but you will be reeled in by every one of them because I'm damned lucky. One of those things is that between myself and Howard, we know a lot of very talented authors. And the list of authors and stories in this magazine is a murderer's row of who's who within modern sword and sorcery. From the trad pup guys like Michael Stackpole, who some of you may know from X-Wings, he is a brand new setting inspired by Roger Zelazny that I can't wait to introduce to all of you. C.L. Warner, who I mentioned earlier, Greg Mell with an Aztec fantasy setting. One of the last unpublished Hanavar stories in print for the first time ever. But also new authors. One of the ones I think will surprise a lot of people, I know it surprised me, was I met an author named Alyssa Hazel at a convention, a small indie horror author who was reading Clark Ashton Smith, which always a good sign. If you see an editor walking around and you're reading the genre they publish, that's a good introduction. But I'd asked if she'd ever written any sword and sorcery, and she had admitted she'd never even written any fantasy, but would love a chance to. I took a swing, gave her the chance, and she sent that. I threw the ball. She sent it into the bleachers, right into the cheap seats with her story, 10 Arrows, which all I'll say is it has a young heroine with just 10 arrows in her quiver and a Mongolian death worm chomping at her heels. It's always a good time when somebody can rope in a Mongolian death worm into their stories. I love Mongolian mythology. But we were looking at, so far we're sitting at, as of right now, because somebody just donated $7,000 in donations. Wonderful. We're already guaranteed one issue. Fully funded, drops February 2026 on the 18th. For those of you that know your history, the same day Weird Tales published their first issue.
Hey.
We're halfway to funding issue 2. Ideally, we will have 3 issues next year in both digital and print. Each 80,000 words, about 75,000 words of hard-hitting, heroic fiction every step of the way. Some serials, some new, and one of those other touches is that some of you guys are new to Swords and Sorcery. One of those things that has been missing from the scene has been paying homage to its past. There is a generation that hasn't even read Robert E. Howard, much less David Drake or Michael Shea. So every issue of Battleborn is going to dig deep into a century of prose fiction in our genre and introduce it to a new generation of readers. In our first 2, we have a poem from Robert E. Howard called The Road of Kings, which is the kind of poem that if we'd read this in class, every young boy would still love poetry, as they should. The Pearls of the Vampire Queen by Michael Shea, in print for the first time on its own since 1977. This author won the World Fantasy Award for Niftaleen, the last time a sword and sorcery novel won it. And he went on to do several with this character, but this particular story is ghoulishly pulpy and so lyrically haunting. It's magnificent. Number 2, David Drake. He had this Roman sword and sorcery setting, Vedius and Dama, that has tragically been completely out of print since 1988. The story we are running, The Manticore, has not been published since before I was born. And I can't wait to crack open the crypt and introduce you to the beasties and bastards tasked with slaying it within. It's a wonderful story from one of our genre's masters, and I'm proud to say every issue of Battleborn will dig deep to not just showcase the very best and brightest of the modern day, but keep the classics circulating, and ideally in a way that I am pulling the kind of stuff even a reader of Sword and Sorcery, a lot of it, might find something they haven't read for years, if ever. But we have an incredible pool of authors, damn fine focus on heroic fantasy and action. And I know I'm going to pour my heart and soul into every issue. So have my authors. And I want everyone who picks it up to feel that same way we all did that first time we picked up those paperbacks.
So what are some of the challenges, like as the editor, as the guy spearheading this project, what have been some of the challenges of selling modern fantasy readers on a magazine? Like that worked very, very well, obviously 100 years ago, but now, like, is that trickier, or what's that been like?
So I don't need to be the first to tell you that short fiction magazines have been in a strange place the past few years. Crowdfunding, for one thing, I will tell everyone, sucks. I say this with love to everyone who donates. I adore you. You make this bearable. But there have been so many technical setbacks, so many headaches, Nobody enjoys crowdfunding, even the guys who make their mints doing this. I love Larry Correia. I'm pretty sure he doesn't like running crowdfunders, even if he makes six figures doing them. It's a miserable experience. I wish we could go to newsstands and just produce the way we used to, but until we have a sustainable business model, this is the easiest way to get started. And it's the way a lot of magazines keep the lights on year after year. So that's one of my goals with Battleborn. I want to cut the Gordian knot. I want to figure out the way to keep that magazine sustainable in the long term without having to do a crowdfund every year, or at least do the crowdfund to put out extra issues or grow, as opposed to just keeping the lights on one more year. I'm going to be producing audiobooks of my magazine because that is such an important market.
Yeah.
Kindle editions were going to be available from day one. That was one of the things Howard and I talked about that hurt Tales of the Magician's Skull, was that it was a physical and PDF only magazine. Mm-hmm. When there's an entire market of millions of readers around the world that only buy books via Kindle.
Right.
You cannot ignore that market. Conversely, too many of these short fiction markets were part of the Kindle Direct Publishing program, which the problem with hitching a ride on a 900-pound gorilla is that eventually it thinks you're a flea and smashes you. And that's hurt a ton of these magazines, where Amazon was their bread and butter, and then Amazon decided they can starve. So I'm hoping between audiobooks, merchandising, comic book subrights, some of the things we're planning, we will be a bit more sustainable, and that's something I will happily share and spread the word on to these other magazines. Because the tragedy in short fiction markets struggling the way they have been is that it's the easiest way to find new readers. I mean, think of a short fiction magazine as a smorgasbord, buffet line for you non-Scandinavians out there. Sure, you might not have liked this story, but try that one. Or you get drawn in by one author, but you come away falling in love with another. It's the same reason the anthology was so much of an art form for much of the genre's history. And the decline of both has made it so much harder for new authors to break in. Especially these days with indie authors the way it is. That's one of the reasons why, in addition to the big names and Tradpub authors in Battleborn, I want the indie authors to have their place, because they need that platform as much as anyone. But we need short fiction as a market, not just as a proving ground for new talent, but to attract new readers. How many people first encountered genre fiction through manga or comic books, video games even, movies? All these are forms where the short fiction really shines. I mean, Conan has been a comic book fixture for 50 years. Well, I think Wheel of Time has failed 3 times to make it past the first book as a comic book for a reason. Serialized storytelling lends itself well to that medium. Yeah. Likewise, the audiobook. I don't mean to keep kicking Robert Jordan, but the Wheel of Time is, 40 hours a book? Meanwhile, you can make yourself way through the entire body of Conan, every single Conan story Robert E. Howard ever wrote, in 20. So the way that modern media is consumed lends itself better to short fiction. Mm-hmm. And I want there to be another generation of readers, because if you look at the numbers, the greatest tragedy of modern fiction is that we've repeated the same mistake American comic books did in the 90s. We cater to a shrinking pool of very well-educated, very well-off adults, which is fine. They can buy 20 to 30 books in a year. Except, where does that next generation come from? For comic books, they made the mistake of catering to divorced dentists who could buy 50 comic books in a month instead of the kid who could buy 5 with his allowance. Now that kid buys manga, and comic books are wondering where their next paycheck is going to come from because Daddy Warner Brothers and Daddy Disney want their rent money. I don't want publishing to make that same mistake. Yeah. We need short fiction markets to prove successful because that's where new readers come from. A novel might be a little too intimidating, but getting an anthology or a magazine with 10 different authors that they can finish in an afternoon, that's the kind of thing that brought me into the genre when I was a kid. I'm a father of a young boy. I look at the shelves and I wonder what's going to make him fall in love with books the way I did, because he is 2 years old and he already loves to read. But I remember my kid brother. I was lucky. I ignored my teachers and read what I enjoyed. We listened, and we've lost more young readers to The Great Gatsby than we did to both World Wars. And luckily, my brother found his way back, but there are plenty of others that don't, that still hate the written word. And I don't want my boy to hate reading because there isn't anything out there for him. So people have asked what my mark of success for Battleborn will be. I have a few. Don't get me wrong. I would love to be sitting on a Scrooge McDuck pile of gold, a kingly hoard, if you would, by selling fantasy to the masses. But I want 10 years from now, Battleborn to be a sustainable magazine and for kids like mine to be able to go to stores, find a magazine of mine, and fall in love with this genre as I did at that age. That is what I'm seeking producing this magazine.
Let me just provide a little bit of like personal experience or a personal anecdote here that I think will help illustrate the point. So recently, and I'll save people have to tune in later to hear my full thoughts, but recently I've been working through this, which is Gardens of the Moon by Steven Erikson. Malazan is famous for being like one of the largest fantasy series ever written, but one of the things that I noticed going from Robert E. Howard almost straight into this is when I would have like a drive coming up, or I'm doing the dishes or something where it's like, all right, I'm going to be doing this for about 20 minutes. It hardly even seems worthwhile to turn on my audiobook to Gardens of the Moon, because it's like, I'm not even going to scratch the surface of a single chapter. This thing is so long. Whereas it almost was a game of like, because Robert E. Howard writes so succinctly and the Conan stories are so digestible, it's almost like, ooh, can I fit one more in? Can I fit one more in? And as with a lot of people my age, like, you know, I have a problem with my phone. And a while ago, I started thinking maybe having the last thing I'm looking at right before I go to bed being, you know, this bright blue light, maybe that's not the best thing for me. So one thing that I've tried doing a little bit more has been like, okay, like read a bit before bed. And short stories have been a great way of doing that, whether it's Robert E. Howard or Flannery O'Connor. And so just to say, like, there is even more than just you get to read a diversity of authors and some people maybe that you wouldn't have picked up before. Even just within the natural schedule of a day, I think there's a functionality to short stories that's been lost or been ignored. That at least I'm discovering that. So
completely. I mean, it's like I said, why I think Howard Andrew Jones cracked the code with Hanavar is that he broke up it is a novel, but it is a novel you can consume in small bits and almost savor it as it comes, as opposed to feel like you're missing out. That you can have that story finished while you're doing the dishes or complete a chapter while you're driving to work. And not much love to Steve Erikson, who has also written some great sword and sorcery. An anthology called Neither Beg Nor Yield. He has a story in it. It's awesome. I hope we see more from him. Perhaps in Battleborn, Steve. Give me a call. But it lends itself well to the modern market in the same way it always has. Like you said, you might not have time to commit to a 14-book series where the average book is heavier than the weights you lift at the gym. And it's not a shame to admit that that's intimidating to a lot of people. For comparison, let me... here we go. Or, let's see. These were novels back in the 1970s. Look how thin they are. And that used to be common. I mean, the paperback book was invented to be able to fit into the shoulder of a pocket during World War II. And we've just let them grow and grow and grow to the point we lovingly, I might add, call them door stoppers. And the problem with that is, to a lot of people, that looks like work as opposed to recreation. I think they're wrong, but there is a utility to having these shorter books available to them and to the market that might not want to commit to a 14-book series, but is willing to commit to a couple of Conan stories.
Yeah, and I have that big bind up, The Great Book of Amber. That's all 10 of Roger Zelazny's Amber novels in one. And it's shorter than like The Way of Kings or The Name of the Wind, you know?
Meanwhile, my Amber...
Yeah, that's right. Like,
look how svet that is. That is the first Amber book. By the way, Dilvish the Damned. If you're a Zelazny fan, seek that one out.
I have it. It's like right over there.
You rock. This is why he's the best, folks.
I haven't read it yet, but it's right there.
The Bells of Jourdain in that book is going to be Roger Zelazny's selection for that book I was working on with Howard, if you're curious. But yeah, this is 167 pages. I don't even think that gets you out of the Shire in Lord of the Rings.
So, Sean, I want you to talk a little bit more about some of the perks and things that people can get just through Indiegogo. I want you to talk about some of the advantages from that a little bit more. And then I have a couple of rapid fire questions before we wrap it up here.
Perfect. So one of the things with Indiegogo that is going to be a crowdfund exclusive. So I know I just hyped up the paperback book, but I am OCD as hell and a little rough on paperbacks because I have a toddler. I love hardcover books. I'm a collector of them. My wife would say hoarder. I agree to disagree. And I want my magazine in beautiful collectible hardcover to those willing to back us from the beginning. So, as a crowdfund exclusive, issues 1, 2, and 3 in hardcover. And just as an added incentive, all formats of the magazine are going to have not just beautiful covers, but black and white interior artwork for every story. So for those who spring for those nice, beautiful, wonderfully rich hardcovers, you get the art in bigger magazine-sized formatting so you can gaze at it lovingly, paint it on your dorm walls or the side of a van in that wonderful sword and sorcery tradition. That is one thing we are exploring, is that anyone who paints one of our characters on a panel van, you get a subscription for the life of the vehicle. We believe in unconventional advertising. Likewise, any rock bands who wants to make a song based on one of our characters, a Hanover concept album, please reach out. We will feed you as much material as you can take. But, okay, you got the hardcovers. That's nice. But let's say you're the man on the go. You prefer your ebooks. What's in it for me? I could say the higher tiers, you get a throwing knife because it's not sword and sorcery if you don't get a weapon. But you've only got a quid or two. Everyone who donates is having their names listed on a page within Battleborn magazine thanking them, and then immortalized forever on our website in our so-called Hall of Heroes. Because you helped us keep fighting the good fight, joining the front ranks of fantasy, and keeping heroic fantasy alive. Because I am confident, with a few issues of this magazine, I will find an audience for this thing. I am not shy about pushing it. But you, brave viewer, you were there from the beginning, and that should be honored, saluted, remembered, treasured, and it will be. But we've also got a few book bundles, one of the more unique add-ons. And some of our more unique benefits are add-ons. Let's say you want to be immortalized forever in a story. Have you ever wanted to be killed by your favorite author? Stabbed through the neck by a sword and sorcery hero, or killed off in some other gruesome and creative way? Well, now is your chance, you sick, twisted freak of a reader. By pledging to that level today, you can be Tuckerized into a story in Battleborn magazine where you or your XP will be brutally torn asunder by our heroes. Or, for all the people who have seen me on the interview circuit, making fun of romantasy, or George R.R. Martin, and want to get your revenge, I am auctioning off editorial spots. Want me to edit your terrible Game of Thrones fanfiction or your romantasy novel pitch before you start selling it around? You can have a professional editor read your work, whether or not I want to or not, and give it the fair, honest shake every professional editor deserves. Or for that matter, you just want me to edit it proper, I will do the same. But if you really want to make me suffer, all comers are accepted, this time only. Now, for those of you preparing your terrible Jaime Lannister slash fiction, the things I do for this magazine.
That's right. That's right. So, I guess one final question I had about the magazine before we get into a few concluding things is, let's say there are two types of readers out there. One who has, maybe they've seen the Arnold movie, or maybe they've only heard of it, but they certainly haven't read much Sword and Sorcery. So we have that type of reader, and then we have another type that they've read literally everything Robert E. Howard has written. They've read Michael Moorcock. They've very immersed in the genre. What do you think Battleborn offers for both the veterans and the greenhorns when it comes to this genre?
Both are important, and Battleborn will cater to both. That is my promise from day one. Because capturing that spirit is important. But for the people who have been with the genre for years, like, I'm sure some of our vetted Sword and Sorcery readers know C.L. Warner and Shintaro Oba. One of the things we're doing that's unique is that C.L. Warner writes his Sword and Sorcery with the reliability of machine gun, by which I mean it's powerful, it's potent, and if you're paying him, he will crank them out faster than you can publish them. But the story in Battleborn issue 1 is the first Oba story. So you get an introduction to the character as he's just starting out, an angle that the people who have been reading him for years have never seen, but for the people new to him, can fall in love from day one, and then join the hunt to see where he goes next in his quest to redeem his honor and kill every monster that dares get in his way. That's one example. But for the newcomers, we are going to be reprinting those classics you may have not ever read. We're going to have essays from editors and academics explaining the history of the genre, where you can read reviews of books that you can go on and look elsewhere, an introduction to these new authors that may be brand new to you, characters you can fall in love with from day one, and to those blooded veterans, the ones who have been with the genre for years. Look at our marquee. Look at the names. Look at the spirit we put into every issue. We will wave that Sword and Sorcery banner proudly every single day. We have Howard Andrew Jones' name on our marquee as our editor emeritus, and the spirit he built into this genre guides us with every page, every story selection, every issue. So if you doubt our pedigree, look to our marquee, look to our authors, and tell us we are not baptized in the fires of combat within this genre. But to both of you, the veteran, the newbie, the newcomer, and the lover of this genre for decades, I want you to look to our logo and fall in love with our brand the same way that readers once did Weird Tales or 2000 AD or Tales of the Magician's Skull. I want Battleborn to be a guarantee that when you pick up an issue of our magazine, you will find something to fall in love with, something that makes you drive for heroics, march that extra mile, feel 10 feet tall, that leave you hungry for the next issue, feeling on top of the world. Because that's why we share those stories of heroes. To light a fire in our bellies, a song in our hearts, and spark something within our soul that only those stories can. That is the beating heart, soul, and spirit of Battleborn. And we will be proud to count all of you in our ranks.
Amen. Well, Sean, I'll ask you as a sort of a final question here.
Oh, please, ask as many as you like. This is fun.
I'll ask, what is a, I was going to say, I asked this of most guests that I interview here, what is a novel, and it can either be science fiction or fantasy, that is one that you love, but you find to be not talked about much or criminally underrated, that you'd like to recommend to both myself and our viewers here?
So I've given you a couple, Niftaleen and Vedius and Dama by Michael Shea and David Drake. Those are both sorely underrated within Sword and Sorcery. But I'm going to cheat and give you the third that I just gave another interview I did. Have you ever heard of an author named Peter Benchley?
Doesn't ring a bell.
So I'm not surprised. Despite the fact he sold 30 to 40 million novels within his life, he has been out of print since he died in 2006, with one exception. He's the guy who wrote a little novel called Jaws.
Oh, yeah, I read Jaws many years ago, yeah.
So he has a wonderful, he is, in terms of a pulp author, a wonderful marriage between that New England literary tradition and the pulp airport novelist like Michael Crichton or Clive Cussler. But I recently reread one of the books of his I loved as a child called White Shark, because there was a panel at DragonCon I was on about shark attack movies. And explaining this book made Jim Butcher laugh until he cried, because on paper, this is the most Saturday morning B movie ever. Because Peter Benchley is the grandson of Nathaniel Benchley, one of the great literary titans of New England. He is a serious author. He wrote Jaws. So how do you top the shark in Jaws? Make him more evil, more sinister, make people more scared. I tell you how. You make the shark a Nazi. And White Shark is of a human-shark hybrid created by the Nazis, killing people in rural New England. And on paper, it should be awful. And yet, this is the proof of how Benchley is a great author. It is chilling, a terrifying novel. He has a gift for getting behind the mindset of this man-eating... I mean, it doesn't matter what monster feature he does. Jaws, The Island, Beast, everything from squids to sharks. He is a master of the mind of the monster. But his action is terrific. His characters are memorable. Even the way he names them have stuck in my mind since I was a teenager. It's a show of how mastering your craft can make even what should be the stupidest premise into a gripping page-turner that has stuck with me for decades. A show, and that's very relevant to Sword and Sorcery as well, because yes, you have your schlocky, terrible Conans that were built to take advantage of, admittedly, people like me when I was 13 who would buy anything that had a guy with a sword on the cover. And then you have Robert E. Howard, Michael Moorcock, Howard Andrew Jones, Larry Correia, Christopher Rocchio, C.L. Moore, masters of their craft who created sagas that stood the test of time, last the ages, reinvent genres, inspire generations. Proof that a great author can make great art of anything, even a Nazi shark.
There you go. I couldn't think of a better way to end this. So, Sean, thank you so much for chatting with me this evening. Yeah, we will have the Indiegogo linked down below. I recommend all of our viewers go and check that out. Yeah, Sean, is there any other social medias or things that our viewers should know about that you want to plug here?
So, Battleborn has a Facebook, a Twitter, and I am on all available social media. Please check out our authors as well. Many of them are active and on the interview circuit as well, and I can't wait for you to get acquainted with them and their work in our pages. But in the meantime, if your heart beats like a battle drum for tales of heroes, if you remember the first time you picked up Conan or Elric and still love the smell of pulp, if you crave the kind of sword and sorcery that makes your heart pound, put a fire in your belly, and burns a place in your very soul, then join us as we bring Blood and Thunder back to the front lines of fantasy. Become a hero. Become a legend. Become Battleborn today.
You're here. Well, thank you for talking, Sean, and thank you everyone else for watching.
Thank you for having me. Let's do this again sometime.
Absolutely. I would love to. So thank you all for watching. We'll see you in the next one. Take care.